Velkommen til Barlus ende etter en deilig treningsøkt i varmen. Dette her er da event 3 av 5 som vi i Klimavenner for Kjernekraft arrangerer under årets Arendalsuke. Og det er kjekt å se at det har kommet en del folk opp denne bakken. Jeg har gleden av å invitere Mark Nelson, som var her for 2 år siden på Arendalsuken. Mark is a global resource when it comes to fighting for nuclear power on this planet. It's called the Radiant Fund, which you are the boss of, right? Where you travel around the planet and work for nuclear power. I got to know Mark 2 years ago, and I have to say it's inspiring what you're able to do on this planet. So yeah, I'm really looking forward to this. Also, I would like to say to the audience that we have 2 more happenings after this. Og de skjer i morgen. Da er det, skal vi se om de er i salen, det er Martin som sitter der, og Jonas som kommer til å snakke litt om kjernekraftens fremtid i Norge. Og så kommer det en til Tore og en til Jonny som skal snakke om kjernekraft og finansiering. Men ja, Mark, take it away.
All right, thank you very much. I am coming here from Chicago, where we use 80% nuclear electricity. So truly, I wanted to start out by saying that I practice what I preach. I was here in Arendal 2 years ago. We had a tiny little talk. We were out at the picnic benches, and there was about, I don't know, 10 people. And I sounded very silly. I was up there saying, you guys have very cheap energy. You're making decent money on oil and gas. Europe is peaceful and decarbonizing, but what if it doesn't work out? What if something goes wrong? What if your energy plan doesn't work? It might not work. And then Russia, very kindly, demonstrated that anything can happen. And what was occurring? Well, your energy prices skyrocketed. There's a number of countries in Europe that are decarbonizing through deindustrializing, which is going to be a very, very bad and ugly economic and then probably political problem in those countries that are doing that. We've seen an insane resurgence of interest in nuclear energy in just that 2 years. And at the beginning of that 2-year period, for my city, Chicago, our political leaders signed a very long-term, cheap energy contract with our nuclear plants, and our electricity bills did not go up during the entire energy crisis. We're one of the only places on planet Earth where that happens. In fact, most months we had a line item that took away maybe half the cost of our electricity bill, just free credit back from the nuclear plants because of the flat contract. And we'll come back to a little bit of what's so weird and interesting about nuclear, because there are other energy sources that are reliable. There are other energy sources that are clean. There are other energy sources that are maybe cheap long-term or cheap up front. Nuclear has a very strange combination of all those things. I would guess that almost everyone here knows what nuclear energy is, but just to make absolute certain, there is a very common metal called uranium sprinkled all over the Earth. We were given lots of it when our solar system formed. It did a good job rising into the continental crusts because of life on Earth putting out oxygen. The oxygen combined with the uranium to allow it to travel along with water. Whenever ancient water sources flowed for many millions of years and traveled through rock that became slightly more acidic or reducing, the oxygen would go away and deposit lots of uranium-based minerals into the rock out of solution from the water. That's why we have pockets of uranium and uranium formations pretty much all over the continental crust, to the great embarrassment and immiseration of uranium investors. There's so much uranium that we keep finding more and more whenever we look around, so the uranium price never soars and doesn't make the uranium investors money. I feel bad for them, but for any country that is worried about where uranium can come from, it's almost everywhere. So you take that uranium out of the ground, you send it through some combination of factories, some of which can be in your country, some people don't want in their country, and then that makes the fuel. You need a few, maybe one little bit like this per person per year at the electricity usage of your country. So each person has their own little pellet. That means that little pellet represents your energy needs for the year, and it also represents your waste burden for the year, and that is extremely small. So these little pellets go in metal rods. The metal rods go in groups of metal rods. The groups of metal rods go with other groups of metal rods. That goes into a big tea kettle, and that makes hot water, which turns into steam, which turns into electricity. For countries with coastlines, and I've heard that Norway has a significant amount of coast, you don't have the famous cooling towers, so it takes away one of the iconic symbols of nuclear, unfortunately, for those who like cooling towers like me. But it means that a few of these factories with a few of these pellets takes care of your electricity needs, and in the future maybe your energy needs for the year, with no need to modify any landscape. So that's nuclear energy, and here we go. So, sorry, one more thing about my background. I'm trained in engineering and a few other things. I graduated with my nuclear engineering degree right into an awful slump in the United States for nuclear energy. Our natural gas was extremely cheap. Renewables seemed very cheap. And the nuclear plants were struggling to find customers, in part because companies were putting their factories near the nuclear plants to use the cheap electricity, but then buying certificates that say they actually got the electricity from a different side of the country, from maybe solar power at night in the winter. And that meant that the nuclear plants were struggling to get revenue, and a bunch of them were closing. I ended up doing a lot of research on my own into electricity markets because I wanted to understand why we were losing nuclear plants that were already built. Nuclear is famously hard to build. Once it's built, you don't need to build it. You can just keep using it forever, as far as we can tell. So the fact that we were losing nuclear plants and making it hard to find nuclear energy jobs pushed me in a weird direction. It turns out that right around 2014, 15, 16, the environmental movement was making its next evolutionary jump. It was going from purely anti-nuclear to having pockets of very strong pro-nuclear sentiment. A lot of this was because a philosophical shift in environmentalism in a few areas that was thinking, wait, if our environmentalism is encouraging us to expand industrialization of nature in order to make low carbon, then we missed the point of environmentalism. So it rethought a bunch of things and said, how can we make more stuff on less area? And nuclear was the natural outcome of that exploration for many of these environmentalists I'm talking about. So I went there as one of the first engineers they ever hired or talked to on energy, electricity, and nuclear subjects. And then it was a wild ride. The NGO world is very strange. I don't know if any of you guys are a part of it, the nonprofit world, but basically we found that almost anywhere we went, just a little bit of suggesting, can we look at nuclear in addition to other energy sources, radically changed the conversation. Some people very angry, reject it. The vast majority of young people around the world we've talked to had never even considered nuclear energy, and it made for a very interesting past, say, 6 or 7 years traveling around the world, learning from people about their own needs, their own energy needs, their own electricity needs, their own ambitions, maybe extra requirements like protecting nature, and then seeing what I could do to explain those conditions back to the nuclear industry. I am a consultant. Although I really love traveling around and I love doing stuff like this, I am doing this as a favor and because I love doing it. My business line is basically telling companies what I see coming in terms of energy demand for those in the nuclear industry, fuel demand, for example, and helping to interpret the needs and wants of the public back to an industry that is famously confused about what people want. So there you go, there's my introduction. Let's go to this funky graph here. What this basically is just looking at the amount of CO2 produced per unit of electricity in Germany and France each day, 1 dot per day basically, for all the years between 2012 and now. What we're seeing is all the energy stories you may have heard that connect to Germany and France, like France having a really bad set of maintenance crises that made it one of the worst performing nuclear fleets in the entire world for multiple years during this period. Those are these bumps, these things. The French government was virulently anti-nuclear from about here till about February 21st, 2022, approximately. Then they discovered they liked nuclear. It was a very interesting transformation to see. So this is containing some of the worst performance and worst luck of any nuclear fleet in the world, and France is almost completely dependent on that nuclear fleet, and that's the sort of unconstant performance there. This is a different universe up here. This is Germany. Germany's carbon emissions here should be substantially higher because they sharply turned off about 12 to 13% of their electricity supply in the span of 16 months, which is almost incomprehensible. This is almost like your country got invaded and your industrial base is being carpet bombed. That's what Germany did to themselves with shutting off so much nuclear power in a tiny amount of time straight into some of the worst energy conditions that have ever been seen in terms of price and availability. The reason why Germany's carbon emissions are not spiking is because they're simply just shutting off their industries. They're just turning them off. The results of this are going to take some time to unfold. I've spent a lot of time in Germany this year. The mood is exceptionally dark. I was kind of astonished to hear the things that I was hearing from German industry. They're basically people with ambition and drive to stay in German industry are preparing to see which country they want to move their families to, because they don't see any future in Germany. All industrial investment in any industries that have even a substantial, not even a majority, but a substantial part of their product cost determined by energy, they've just sharply stopped all plans for investing in Germany. And 2 words came over and over. USA, China. USA, China. USA, China. That's where the future of industry is in Germany. So that's why Germany has been able to stay only 10 times worse than France on carbon. There are maybe some extenuating circumstances people could pull up, but this is such a powerful 1-2 punch because these countries have close to the same population. They have sort of similar fossil fuel resources. Germany has supplies of coal that France never had and can never get. So maybe that forced France's hand a little bit. They have similar areas, they have similar sunlight amounts, they have similar, well, France has a lot more hydro, but they have similar connections on the grid to other countries. They have so much in common that this diversion is extremely instructive. Now, does any of that apply to Norway? Well, we're about to find out. So here's our buddy Bill Gates, who has quietly at first and then very loudly been supporting and investing in nuclear electricity. And he's making a very nice statement that we're now going to pull into a graph. Nuclear has some really special characteristics, many of them stemming from that opening statement where I said just a tiny little bit of metal ends up turning into all of your electricity for the whole year. Well, that unlocks some very nice capabilities. So for example, as Norway knows, there's an amazing amount of demand for your beautiful, beautiful natural gas, and people are willing to pay you a lot of money for it, and likely will for a long time to come. The only issue is it appears to be altering the composition of the atmosphere. So other than that, and also being very easy to interrupt supplies to other countries, almost impossible to defend pipelines, it turns out, and very difficult and expensive to set up the factories to turn it in natural gas into a liquid and put it on the ships. That's a significant disadvantage. But the advantage is, once that happens, once you can produce it, almost any country can, if they want to, set up something to burn it, a little bitty gas turbine, and they can set up that gas turbine pretty quickly. They can buy it from a factory, and they can plug it into their grid anywhere along their grid, and they're ready to go, as long as they can receive the gas and afford to pay it. So, that's very nice. Let's move on. Nuclear, well, there's the green checks, but obviously later, I know there are lots of complaints people have about nuclear. You may not have those complaints, but you may be curious what my answer is, good or bad, about those complaints. At any point, if you have a question, definitely raise your hand. We do have a microphone that can go out to the audience, but you can also just shout it, and I will stop and answer it. But for now, you can see that I am a fan of nuclear energy, and it gets all 4 green checks, luckily. So, hydropower, one of the things I heard in 2021, I talked to some people in Oslo, some friends made some connections for me, and I was told very bluntly, to bring up nuclear power in Norway is to expose yourself as a silly person, a non-serious person, because we have all the hydro we need, and we'll just start decarbonizing and maybe sell less fossil fuels in the future. Well, that extraordinary confidence lasted for about 5 months after those conversations at the last time I was here. What happened? Well, it turns out that you can make money selling hydropower to other countries, and you can have enough for yourself even in a drought, but it's very hard to do both at the same time. There was also another slight complication, which is a lot of the countries around Norway realized that they didn't need to have good energy policies because they could just get energy from Norway instead. So there was you might call it for you nerds in the audience, a phase change where you went from extremely low electricity prices, occasionally making money at high prices off of Europe, to extremely high prices, occasionally wind and solar needs in the rest of Europe means that the price drops for a little bit. And you, had a factor of 10 increase in electricity cost despite not really building much capacity. You didn't really have more power. It's not clear that that money did anything for Norway. It's just you had incredibly expensive electricity, and suddenly there's a new mood among those very serious people not to call nuclear energy as silly as they used to. The war also helped. So, hydropower actually is still weather-based energy, and a lot of people don't realize that until the drought hits. I will note that the earliest warning sign that was already available in August 2021 that there was going to be something weird coming in energy is that Brazil was having nearly unprecedented droughts that was sending its hydro capacity factors, its production of hydro crashing, and was leading to unusually high demand for fossil fuels right when Europe needed to start filling for winter, which is about when Russia started turning down the taps and springing its little trap on Europe. So our earliest warning of the global energy crisis was actually a hydro crisis unfolding halfway across the world. So hydro's got some issues, and almost every nuclear in the plant in the world is immune to this problem. We can come back to that later. Geothermal, there's a lot of news breakthroughs being talked about geothermal. Essentially, what's happening is advanced drilling techniques and well finishing techniques for fracking are being brought to bear in the United States for geothermal. There are still really, really bad physical limits on geothermal. Rock does not conduct heat very well, so you may have a cheap well, but if you use too much energy out of your hole, you will cool off that area and have to wait for some time to fully use your equipment. A lot of the world's most productive geothermal is in the United States and has been slowly cooling over the years, and either we have to use it less, just infrequently, or we're just gonna run out of rock heat and have to come back in another decade. That's a fairly weird issue, even for places that have hot rock. We will see if the new drilling techniques and the new, a lot of things that people decide they don't like when it comes to hydrocarbons, let's see if they're okay with those same drilling techniques and well finishing techniques when it comes to clean energy. I have some doubts, but I'm ready to be surprised. So there's geological and geospatial issues with geothermal. Biomass, okay, the general issue with biomass, I'm sure you guys know a little bit of this, is once you set up a system for burning biomass, you tend to obtain that biomass no matter what. So for example, in the UK, there was these grand schemes to have a really sustainable biomass pellet program for these giant boilers that they made out of the old coal plants. So they made these big power facilities and converted them to run off of pellets of wood. Once you set up an international financial marketplace for pellets of wood, your trees can come from very interesting sources. There are hardwood forests in the United States that are being logged to send pellets to the United Kingdom so that they can have carbon-free green energy. Now, other countries do it differently. For example, Germany, some people think that they burn trees for their bioenergy. No. What they do is they have about 8% of their cropland, or about 4% of their national territory, just growing bioenergy crops for a pathetic little sliver of their electricity demand. Which it gives you a way to think about energy, and why I started with that statement about the little pellet providing your energy. The amount of acreage needed to provide somebody with their energy is ultimately a factor of like sunlight on the cornfields of Germany, and the equipment and harvesting space needed, and the also the digester and combustion space needed. When you add all that up, you get a system that's about a quarter of the emissions of natural gas. In other words, if Germany was 100% bioenergy, it would not even get them down to French levels, even if they didn't burn any gas, any coal, any oil, any of that, just from the emissions in their process. But also, they would need essentially their entire territory to provide only electricity, not all energy, for a population significantly smaller than what they have. That's the problem with bioenergy. And if they insisted on trying, they would probably end up seriously disrupting either food markets internationally or forestry product markets internationally, because once you pay a lot of money to get a burner, the tendency is to find the fuel to burn in it. It's my issue with biomass. Wind, solar, I think these issues are common and discussed enough that I'm going to move on for now. So one of the least discussed parts of nuclear energy is that every year that passes, we're learning that nuclear energy ages less like, humans, and a little bit more like antique furniture. So a lot of the nuclear plants in the world were built in the 60s or in the 70s and the 80s. A lot of them operated at between 40 and 70% capacity factor during their first decade of life. A lot of those very same reactors are now operating the best they've ever operated in their existence as they age. It's because nuclear reactors are mostly kind of complicated, and as we figure out how to run them, we're sharing experience between all the reactors in the world. Like almost every nuclear plant in the world is able to share with others. There are actual organizations who have a single purpose: to share lessons and to create really intensive training and quality programs, almost like on a volunteer basis for volunteer recipients. It's just like peer pressure, and that leads to big bumps in operating performance and an extended life for these reactors. The key thing is, as long as the containment structures, meaning the big, say, concrete domes over them, are kept in good shape, as in not cut into or allowed to crack or degrade. And there are concrete domes in the world that are thousands of years old. This is not hard to keep a dome in good condition. Then almost every single piece inside the reactor can be replaced. And the troubles we have with constructing entire plants from scratch are almost always avoided from the short and easy upgrade programs to keep them operating permanently. I have a long debate going with other nuclear experts about how long these reactors will last. Every time I visit a nuclear plant, I talk to the technical team about the health of the steel inside the center of their plant, the reactor pressure vessel, the big, thick tea kettle that holds the uranium fuel and suffers the most intense heat, most intense pressure, and the most intense bombardment from subatomic particles. And what I keep hearing over and over and over is things like this. Well, we're operating well now, but we don't want to guess about how long we can go. And I say, okay, well, you're getting your 50 or your 60-year license. Yes. Okay, your reactor pressure vessel is going to be good by the end of that? Oh, yeah. 6 years, our pressure vessel will be fine. Then you're going to go for longer? Probably. Do you think that at the rate of degrading of your steel, you're going to have a problem for 80? No, probably not. What about 100? And then they get panicked where they cannot actually see something causing degrading steel enough that they would need to shut, but they also feel that the public would not trust them or their company would be upset if they said, yeah, these reactors can go to 100. But since I talk to them, and I'm not quoting them by name, and I can speak on the record, even though they speak to me off the record, here I'm saying to you now, I absolutely expect to see century reactors for the reactors designed and put into service in the late 60s and 70s. Reactors now are being built with longevities like that in mind from the beginning, from day one, and I expect that we're going to see, by the end of our lifetimes, especially for those of us who are, say, about 30, so I'm 33, we are going to see permanent nuclear. We're going to see nuclear lasting through 4 and 5 generations of workers by the time I retire. I have gone to nuclear plants in the last few years where they are on 3rd generation of the same family working the same site. This means when you're looking at the cost of nuclear, you literally run out of comparisons because we are not set up to be able to compare 40, 50, 80, 100-year assets with 20-year or 25-year assets. It's just, we have not found a way that everyone agrees on in accounting math to actually do that pricing. This graph that I'm showing you is one of the first efforts by an internationally trusted and respected body to start including this information, and what they basically have to do is additional 10 to 20-year extension, or extensions, plural S. So that means if you take the 20-year and the plural S, you're talking about 40-year, they're just basically saying another 40 years, another 40 years, and the price of that another 40 years is essentially the cheapest high-quality energy that humans have ever developed. The only thing you have to do is survive this for the first 30 years in building it. It's really hard and tricky to find nuclear costings out there. If people are especially curious about this and you know various prices of energy, if you speak this language, just talk to me afterwards and I have sort of anecdotal data for you about what different modern build costs have been, what operating costs are for plants around the world, enough for you to get a sort of rule of thumb of what you should expect from nuclear power. So one of the really neat tricks that wind and solar have is that when they wear out, that puts them off the end of this chart and makes them that not their problem. So with wind, you may be needing to replace it every 20 years, every 20 years, every 20 years, even if you didn't make a profit that you can use to buy the next 20 years of wind turbines, you would need to do it anyway with the wind turbines going out of service. We are about to enter a very interesting time in a number of advanced economies where the average age of a wind turbine is advancing closer and past, or to and then past midlife for those wind turbines. What we're finding is that a lot of the insurance companies who wrote the insurance policies for wind turbines are starting to put out messages saying, hey everybody, we're in huge trouble. Our fleets are lasting much less than we thought, and we're going to have to radically increase our insurance rates for new plants. This is just one of the things that is leading to an end of the narrative that wind and solar are getting cheaper. Policy people, so politicians and thought leaders and other folks like that are still saying the whole wind and solar are the cheapest ever and they're getting cheaper. It's no longer true anymore, partly because of this maintenance issues, partly because of the end of free money, partly because of using up the best spots for wind and solar, partly because of using up the grid that you need to start expanding to do wind and solar, and then partly because now that the wind and solar that already exists is aging, it's leading to, well, a complete lack of this. You cannot get that out of wind and solar. Now, having said that, in order to earn this second 40 years of incredibly cheap, clean energy, you have to be able to do the first 40 years, and some countries just aren't going to be able to make it work. Not every worm turns into a butterfly. So some countries are just not going to make it in terms of having enough wealth to justify the next generation's investment in large-scale energy. And we're seeing, I mean, one of the things I hate looking for, but I do look for, is the countries that have increased their wealth, their complexity, their technological capabilities up to a certain point, and are now starting to go downwards. And I mean, I'm talking like a multi-century scale here, and it's what you look for is the end of cheapening electricity. As electricity starts to get much more expensive, it starts to drive away all the things that gave us growth and development in previous generations. It's not clear to me that permanently high electricity costs will come at the same time as continued high standards of living for those countries that can't fix the problem. So I guess I'm really talking about Germany there, but it's stuck in my head because I was there for the last like 5 weeks. Okay, so I'm going to go onwards here. So I've learned that Norwegians have complex feelings about wind turbines. It's true in many places, but the strength of the emotions in Norway are really shocking to me. I know there's a Facebook group with what, like over 6 digits of Facebook followers in Norwegian. All the posts are Norwegian. I would assume the radical majority of the people in the Facebook group are Norwegian, and it's just a giant group that are against wind turbines. I get it. They are really huge, and they don't provide a lot of energy. So just if you sacrifice your community, the skyline, the environment, to get wind turbines, it scarcely does anything for the whole, and I think people are ready for that sacrifice to be in other communities other than their own. And the strength of that feeling is stronger in rural America than it is in urban America, but it's extremely strong in Norway. This is the basic map. This is Finland's largest nuclear plant. I'm going to go there in just a few days. Really excited to see it. I think they have a very good color scheme, and I think that nuclear would be more popular if more care was taken in the decorative parts of the plants. But yeah, I'm happy to see that. What you see here is math that pretty much holds true for most countries. There's about a 2 to 500 factor difference between the amount of area required per unit energy from a wind turbine farm versus a nuclear plant. For solar, it's very much dependent on the latitude. The best solar countries with similar nuclear plants can have a ratio of about 1 to 100 or 1 to 150. The worst solar countries, like up here, the numbers get really, really extreme, and I don't put them on because it makes me look unserious to say like, you know, a factor of 2,000 power difference. But that's what we're looking at in countries that aren't very sunny, like Norway, compared to nuclear. But I don't think I have to tell you guys who don't have sun. You guys are the expert on Norwegian sun conditions, so I just put in the wind turbines for you. What this means is it becomes extremely difficult to keep the growth rates that we initially saw in wind and solar, despite the fact that a lot of countries have energy plans entirely based on the growth rates and the spreading rates of wind and solar during the period before much of the public decided they didn't want it anymore. Germany is just one of the countries that's now experiencing this. I just visited a friend who's at the edge of one of the most famous forests of Germany, where 2 years ago, they put these big logging roads in and they have these huge areas of this famous forest cut down. But then they ran into an issue because it turns out that when you cut down the forest at the top of a mountain, it does a lot of horrible things to your soil, and it actually does impact the creatures who live in that forest and who fly above it. So because of lawsuits, they haven't touched it. When I went there, I said, the forest looks fine, and they said, well, you can't see the patches of land from down here. So I went up, I saw the patches of land clear cut for this wind farm, and I thought, that is insane. How could they just don't Germans love forests? How can they just cut down their oak and hardwood forest for this thing? Then I asked my friends, how much power are you actually generating by putting a spine of wind turbines in this entire forest that would easily be a national park in lots of other countries? And they said, oh yeah, it's like 75 megawatts. So I did a little math in my head and I realized they cut a big logging road and a big network of like these huge patches of land in one of their best forests for amount of power that would be in like a diesel generator the size of this room. That's it, but without the reliability. And for that, they were going to put 200 and 300 meter wind turbines that makes the same power as a tiny little backup generator at like a hospital or something. Yeah, so when that word gets out, suddenly people who didn't like nuclear and never considered it have a new way to see, wait, you're saying with one nuclear plant I have to never look at energy and infrastructure again? Yep, that's what I'm saying. So that's why this power density thing is, I think, especially relevant for Norway. I'm going to jump through this a little bit quicker. If you guys are interested, I can definitely come back, but there's a lot of claims that Norway's energy usage and especially electricity usage need to go up a lot if you guys are going to be the home of the industries that are, refugee industries that are fleeing our friends in Germany. You would definitely need that kind of power increase. I have to be honest with you. What I'm seeing is countries where the electricity price goes up a lot are not going to need much energy growth at all, because instead you're just not going to grow. It's not like you're going to grow and just pay it with magic money that appears from somewhere. The industrial uses and the decarbonization needs that would need that clean energy are just simply going to go elsewhere if you don't have a way of expanding it that maintains low cost on average, high availability over long periods of time. Which is why I noted the lifespan of the nuclear. But it's not clear you're going to grow hydro much. I was trying to find weather modeling of, are you guys supposed to benefit or be harmed by global warming in terms of hydro production? And what I saw is you're supposed to grow a tiny bit. Here's the problem. If it doesn't grow in a particularly bad year, like 2021 to 2022, you can do generational damage to your energy industries in a very short period of time while waiting for the averages to be dragged back up by the beneficial global warming effects of more hydro flooding your valleys. So, yeah, just something to keep in mind. All right, so here's a bunch of randomly selected headlines from countries around yours. I'm still thinking of that lovely conversation strolling around the new opera house area in Oslo, where I was told very directly that to bring up the subject of nuclear in Norway is to out yourself as an unserious person, followed immediately by a massive energy crisis. I keep thinking about that. But how have your neighbors responded to this situation? Here's what they are doing. I've gone to Norway a bunch because it's so exciting what they're doing. I just have to watch. I just want to watch and see what happens in a country that's basically a highly organized city-state with a geopolitical foe at the door, where if you need to check in the environmental ministry, you run across the street from the nuclear energy startup to go check in with them, and you can run back for lunch, and it's just a tight-knit group of people who know the stakes, the survival stakes of getting energy right or wrong in their country. So it's thrilling to go, because every time I go back, some next new level of preparation work is already done. So Estonia is a country on a hurry, and it's fascinating to watch. They have some of the most unbelievably nasty fossil fuels known to man. There's like this crumbly orange and yellow rock that they burn. And it has an ash level that's just like they barely reduce the volume of the rock before they have to get more of it. It's called a oil shale. And it is almost all of their energy supplies, and it's almost all at a single power plant. So you can easily see a country like this just keeping the same grid, just making a power plant that plugs in the way the shale oil used to, and doing a massive drop in their energy costs and a huge amount of decarbonization with like 1 or 2 reactors. It's pretty cool. So Latvia and USA, that's an interesting headline, because obviously as people from Latvia are going all the time to pay very close attention to Estonia. Why do I mention these two countries? because I keep seeing that the peer effect is one of the strongest forces anywhere in the world for countries to do nuclear. I'll get to the oil and gas countries, but I just wanted to mention in this context, Qatar has been running a dirty campaign against the UAE's nuclear program for a really long time. These are two really intense regional rivals. One of them took a very huge risk and went towards a nuclear program. The other one said, no, we're better than that. We're not going to do nuclear. That's crazy. So as an example for this, when the United Arab Emirates launched their first nuclear reactor in summer of 2020, the New York Times didn't put it in the clean energy section. They put it in the Middle East section, and they said, anxiety and worries as a Middle East country nuclearizes. And they quoted Qatar officials in why this was a bad thing. So that's the sort of sophistication of the campaign to influence other people against nuclear because they didn't do it. They have dropped this campaign. There's now positive coverage coming out on Al Jazeera about nuclear. I've been asked to speak on Al Jazeera, and you don't talk to me if you want a negative story for nuclear. I mean, I'll tell you guys negative things about nuclear, but they can get those from the anti-nuclear people just fine. They don't have to get it from me. So things are changing in Qatar now that the UAE's nuclear program has been such an extraordinary success. We can talk a little bit more about that when I talk more about oil and gas countries. What you're seeing also is country after country in Europe having a very intense change of politics, partly triggered by the energy crisis, and the new governments that come in do 180s on nuclear. It's been gratifying to watch. So, here's where we get one of the most interesting emerging topics in the entire energy world. Countries that sell oil and gas have been told there's no future for it, you need to phase it out, not only are your supplies going to run out, but we're going to stop buying it. Germany had a sweet thing going with Russia where they got an immense amount of cheap gas that they didn't have any long-term contracts for, and it was very cool until it wasn't. And now when Germany's going around the world to get energy supplies, it has this series of stupid conversations. They say, hi, we need you to invest many, many billions of dollars to make new export capacity for liquefied natural gas, but we need you to just find other customers for it after the 3 or 4 years we went to buy it, because we have a climate program. Do you see our climate program? And it says what you're selling us is awful, but we'd like some. So they have that, and they're having to do like 10 and 15-year contracts anyway that cut directly against almost all the German government's rhetoric on how much energy they're going to use and need and everything, but they're having to do it because oil and gas exporting countries are tired of being told that their products are evil, sell it to us now. And this is the new development going forward. Long-term contracts for a lot of these fuels. Norway, I'm sure you guys have a wonderful, complicated conversation on oil and gas. I don't speak Norwegian, but I see a number of pavilions down there that seem to be competing almost entirely on whether Norway should or shouldn't have oil and gas in the future. But here's a little key thing that we're learning from the UAE. If you are making lots of money now in the short term from oil and gas, you can turn that money into nuclear plants, which will give you extreme option value in the future. Here's an anecdote from the UAE. They had their nuclear program on schedule, under budget, it was doing really well, yeah? But just in case they didn't turn on their reactor in time, they needed to have gas capacity, they needed gas supplies for themselves to use. A little bit like a dealer using their own supply. They needed a certain amount of gas reserved for if their nuclear plants struggled, because their nuclear plants were directly replacing electricity from natural gas. The energy crisis hit, their newest reactor came in on time, and a single year of those gas sales paid for 50% of the capital cost of that reactor that's going to last for 100 years. 1 year of gas sales of just the volume replacing 1.4 gigawatts of nuclear generation, approximately 500,000 or 600,000 people's worth of electricity, just to give you a rough supply. So 10% of your national demand from a single device, roughly the size of this room, contained in a building just a bit larger. That's what we're talking about. That came on. They sold the LNG tankers of gas to the world market, like to Germany, and they made several billion euros profit on that gas, and that paid for about half of the 5 billion euro investment to build a reactor in the first place. That's the sort of economics I think caught the attention of well, countries like Saudi Arabia, which is now very rapidly moving towards a nuclear program. In fact, the demands of cooperation in civilian nuclear energy are finally achieving what generations of politicians failed to, which is we're on the cusp, it looks like, of a security agreement between, say, USA and Saudi Arabia and Israel and Saudi Arabia that acknowledges Israel as an unblocker for Saudi Arabia getting access to IP or even services in nuclear from the USA. We're not even particularly good at the moment at exporting nuclear, but if Saudi Arabia doesn't want to be held hostage by the few countries that are not in our orbit in nuclear energy, like if they want Korean reactors, they've got to be able to deal with the US because a lot of that is currently IP that the US claims, so Korea can't export. All of this is superseding in importance century-long animosities and prejudices that have stopped there from being a stable peace in the Middle East. That's kind of fascinating. And here's a question. Obviously the option value to sell extra oil and gas to the global market is kind of cool, or leave it in the ground because you don't need it for your own needs. But there's something else that I think is really important here. There's a lot of talk about hydrogen economy. Chances are, if you heard the word hydrogen come up, even in an energy specialist environment, it's about to be some of the dumbest things you've ever heard in your entire life, where anybody with any engineering education realizes that everyone's just bullshitting because they see the prospect of immense government subsidies and they need it really quick before the people figure out the game, and it is. A lot of the people I've talked to about hydrogen, I say, you just careful, hydrogen is not a source of energy, it only carries energy from one place to another, and they're like, what does that mean? I just want a hydrogen economy. I'm thinking, this is not going to go well. But for those who attempt it, for anyone who sees a future in hydrogen, any country that has both oil and gas production and nuclear electricity and heat is going to completely just corner the market, because they will be able to undercut everybody on the carbon emissions intensity of any of the base hydrocarbons or the hydrocarbon-derived petrochemicals and, say, fertilizers and things that would come out of this combine of having the carbon molecules and hydrogen molecules from the ground and the non-carbon heat and energy used to crack and recombine these particles to make what you might call green chemicals industry. So UAE is absolutely aiming to have a green chemicals industry, and it's going to take both parts. You need the hydrocarbons, and you need the carbon-free, ultra-reliable, cheap marginal cost nuclear power in order to get these two things. What's fascinating about Germany is they neither have the cheap clean energy nor the hydrocarbons. So I have no idea what they think they're going to do, but I'm in good company because they have no idea what they're going to do. Norway's got half of that. You've got the hydrocarbons, and maybe you can send your hydrocarbons off to a country that combines both hydrocarbons and nuclear so they can make the higher value-added stuff. But I think it'd just be smoother if you guys had your own zero-carbon cracking power and Haber-Bosch powering process power for you to do your own recombining carbon-free, and then for you to make a killing selling these cleaner, increasingly clean, if people wanted, clean hydrogen-derived chemicals and services to the rest of the world. So that's a huge opportunity. It's clearly something that the oil and gas producers elsewhere in the world are looking at. All right, so summing it up, that extra 40 years followed by extra 40 years followed by extra 40 years means the nuclear plants you build today are going to be ultra long-lived, multi-generational wealth. The better you are at building them today, the sooner you get to reap the enormous benefits of it. Otherwise, you suffer through what the US did, where we were on our path to being almost like France with building an immense number of power plants per capita, and they got really expensive, we got bad at building it, we lost our appetite, the anti-nuclear movement got more powerful, and we just kind of sort of gave up and stopped building it. So yeah, the lowest long-term cost, that's actually really important. The high-value hydro exports, this is basically saying that if you have absolute, guaranteed, low-cost baseload electricity, regardless of the season, regardless of drought conditions, from, say, nuclear, then you will always have cheap power for yourselves while continuing to make a lot of money off of the bad energy decisions of your neighbors. Very good. No, I'm not saying it's good to make a ton of money off your neighbors. You want some prosperity to flow to other countries, but that would put Norway in an extremely strong position as other countries explore the various ways not to make electricity. So the landscape and seascape, you guys know that even better than me. Like I said, I was astonished at the intensity and presence of anti-wind movements here down at the Arendalsuka. The drought proof is because, like I said, you'll never really have a cooling tower in this country, I think. You'll always have access to extremely cool ocean water, and you just run it through, run it back a few degrees hotter, just like other countries do with their nuclear plants on the coast. That's done. You avoid an entire class of expenses and risks that, for example, France lost, I mean, it was in headlines around the world. France lost 0.2% of their power generation last year because of drought conditions and low rivers. Although that sounds extremely low, nuclear has higher standards than other industries, so even that 0.2% became an extremely loud story pumped around the world. Oh, France is running out of nuclear because of, well, again, 0.2%. But that was because of, say, 5 to 10% losses on specific hours or specific parts of afternoons. You don't want that. Even though it averaged to very good conditions for the whole year, you don't want that happening. That will never, ever be an issue in Norway unless you stop having the sea. So, no issue for you there. Ancillary benefits. I was intentionally vague there, but countries with nuclear energy are just, they're just kind of in a different class, and they kind of sit at the adult table when it comes to a lot of the most serious discussions in the world. So it's good to have nuclear just for a sort of status and maturity thing. But you also get other things like the possibility, if you have entrepreneurs interested and you build the right type of reactors, to play a part in the emerging global market for isotopes. So Canada has a nuclear reactor design that's particularly good at producing large amounts of medicines inside the reactor, and so they have a very good side business doing that sort of thing. There are emerging cancer treatments that will only come from those able to make large amounts of exotic isotopes within nuclear reactors. That's going to be something that's pretty cool for the countries that choose nuclear. And then finally, there's an import-export thing that's very cool about nuclear, where you get an enormous amount of the value of nuclear within your country, even if you don't produce a bit of the fuel yourself. So at a well-run nuclear plant, you can expect the fuel cost to be maybe 25, 30% of the cost of running a reactor. At a normal nuclear plant, it's smaller. It's maybe 15, 20% of the cost of running nuclear. Of that, the natural uranium cost is maybe a quarter of that. So like, depending on the expensiveness of your nuclear plant, it can be, say, 2 to 5% of running your plant is the uranium. What is all the rest? Wages paid to very well-employed workers at the plant itself. It makes, for any of you economists, it makes all the graphs look really good. So, finally, not that you have to do things just because your neighbors do it, but your neighbors up here without fossil fuels are doing more nuclear, and your peer countries that have fossil fuels are doing nuclear. It would seem that there's a natural case, just if you didn't know anything else about nuclear, that if that many countries with that many connections to Norway's past and present and future are doing nuclear, it's worth a serious discussion, and it's not just something a silly person would say. All right, thank you very much, everybody. Let's have some questions. Wait, is it only going to be people who already know me? Let's wait a few questions in and let...
Hey there, my name is Rob. Currently I'm doing research within international relations. It's a little bit more academic maybe and specific, but I would love to know if you have insights. You talked a little bit about NGOs. If you have insight in the global governance, how nuclear energy is being promoted or not, and especially maybe also the International Atomic Energy Agency, if you have anything to do with them, if you can assess them, if you can talk about how much are they doing a job to promote nuclear energy or not. and how you view, like, what is the general field looking like? What are the big players within global governance?
Great.
Nuclear energy?
Great questions, and I'm going to challenge myself to answer extremely complicated things in very short statements. So let's start with the easy ones. The IAEA was not promoting nuclear, despite its direct founding mandate to promote nuclear. And under current leadership, it now is. So it went from not doing it to doing it. So you can look up who the leaders are, and you can see the switch over. So that not promoting nuclear despite it being a founding mandate is actually something we see in a number of organizations that were founded back in the optimistic years of, say, the 50s or the 60s. You know, the Atoms for Peace program was a philosophy that the most powerful countries in the world were reserving aspects of nuclear to themselves, but in return, they were going to try to get all the benefits, all the peaceful nuclear things to as many countries as rapidly as possible. There was very little action on this from really powerful global countries for quite some time. So for example, in America, once we stopped building nuclear for ourselves, we kind of stopped building it for other countries. We had a few projects here and there, but those projects kind of tapered out too. Whereas, say, a country like Russia, not known for incredible advances in international cooperation and governance, they were simply just getting extremely good building nuclear reactors for people. So if you're Russia and you're building immense, century-long relationships, building these nuclear plants for, well, let's see at the moment, Belarus, India, China, Turkey, Egypt. They've got a bunch of starts of programs in a huge number of countries. They lost a bunch of those starts when they invaded Ukraine. That made some bad blood in Eastern Europe, as you might imagine. But they are just building an immense amount of nuclear power plants for countries that desperately need the electricity. Not even the nuclear electricity. They need the electricity at all. And then China was making big moves to get into the game. There was a sudden realization of this in Washington starting about 2016, where they realized that our big program to just not help anybody with nuclear, or if we are going to help, just basically get in their way, insult them, be slow, was driving countries into the customer lists of China and Russia, where Russia and China don't insult their clients, they don't tell them what's what, they just build them nuclear reactors, for better or worse, they just build them nuclear reactors. And that realization fully took hold, I think, in the US by about year 2000. The big question was, from 2000 to 2021, was that understanding going to last through a change in administration? And it absolutely 100% did. So what you now have is pretty much everybody in the UN Security Council agreeing that nuclear is important and that it should be spread around the world. And I think different people have different appraisals of the effectiveness of the UN, the effectiveness of IAEA, the effectiveness of international cultures, of international headquarters, international bureaucracies. But at the point that everybody in the UN Security Council really thinks that nuclear is good, should be built at home, and should be exported, it's gonna move forward. It just is. The IAEA is interesting because different countries have mandates to operate different parts of the IAEA. Russia has a crucial function running the IAEA, and just because they invade another country doesn't stop this. It makes for really weird, and I've visited twice in the last few months, makes for an odd atmosphere. I studied Russian, I lived in Russia for a bit. It was like the first time I ever went to Europe was to go live and study in Russia. So Russia was kind of a big part of my, say, cultural life. And because they were the top in nuclear energy, I could see a career that involved more Russia contact. Then they did a war and everything became really awkward and strained. The speculation was this might destroy the ability of Russia to even continue on the work sites around the developing world where they're building reactors. That quickly was proven false, and they continue to build reactors. So here's the way I see it. There are people in Washington, D.C. promoting America building more nuclear reactors for other countries because they they're claiming that if those countries get Chinese and Russian reactors, they'll be outside of our orbit and they'll not be our friends forever and ever. I don't think this is true. The truth is that Russia can build you every single bit of your nuclear reactor, but then you can just get the fuel for somebody else and cut off contact with the Russians. Not that I'm not giving you advice to get a Russian reactor in Norway, I'm just saying the fuel does not constrain you the way it does with fossil fuels. In fact, last statement I'll say on this international stuff, and we won't work on proliferation anymore here, we can talk afterwards. A natural gas turbine designed in Russia, built in Russian factories, installed and maintained in Russia by Russians, owned by a Russian company, is made in Germany, built by Germany, maintained by Germans, owned by Germans, and supplied through German-funded pipelines, is at the mercy of Russia, and a Russian-built nuclear plant, fueled by Russia, with Russian consultants and Russian financing, truly, truly does belong to whichever country it's built in, because that country can just get Russian-type fuel from Westinghouse. Does that make sense? So the fuel source really does depend, or determine the international relations aspects of an energy source, and that's what Germany just discovered. German natural gas plants without Russian-supplied natural gas, nearly useless, and Russian-built nuclear plants across Eastern Europe can be fueled in the Russian designs by Western companies. That's the really important part. The tricky part is you just have to get them built. And it's just not clear you actually have to have international cooperation in order to do it. So there you go. Okay.
I know that once
Microphone.
sorry, the other thing. Thank you. I know that obviously once operational, like nuclear plants don't release any carbon, but what is the sort of climate price of nuclear fuel itself?
It's extremely low. And I can give you numbers, especially just comparative numbers with wind and solar. The basic thing on all of this is you need almost no fuel. If you had to make as much nuclear fuel as you do coal, and to burn in a coal plant, first of all, nobody would do nuclear then, but then you'd have a much higher carbon footprint from making the fuel. One of the most common objections I hear from Greens, especially in Germany, is they say, no, nuclear is actually high carbon because you have to make the fuel. What a lot of this is left over is like assuming that you use an ancient type of uranium enrichment technology fueled by a coal plant. That's what they do to like jump the numbers up to about 100 grams of CO2 per kilowatt hour, which is it's sort of the fake number that's thrown around by green groups. There are no countries in the world that enrich uranium using that ancient method, and a country like France that runs enrichment plants using French nuclear electricity, this is the circular economy. This makes for a profoundly low carbon fuel, especially with modern mining techniques for uranium where more than half of the uranium that's mined in the world, they don't dig a mine anymore. They just put in a few, they drill a few holes, they pass a uranium-seeking fluid through the uranium ore, bring it up the other side, turn it into fuel. So when you do that sort of thing, and you don't intentionally shut down reactors early, you end up with about 4 grams of CO2 per kilowatt hour for the life cycle of nuclear, which then kind of rides a little bit lower over time as you pay off the carbon debt of the steel and concrete that goes into the facility. So it's really low. To compare this, the absolute gold standard for wind is from about that 4 level up a little higher. Of course, it needs to be backed up by something, and that's often fossil fuels, but it's from about that level of nuclear up maybe a factor of 5 or 6 higher. Solar starts at about that 5 or 6 higher level, so 15 to 20 grams of CO2 per kilowatt hour for the life cycle of solar, on up to something like 80, 90, or 100, because the radical majority of solar production has concentrated in China, where they just have they build a coal plant next to the solar factory just to make the highest energy part of the solar system. Becomes difficult to pay that off. One more thing though. When you have those carbon numbers for wind or solar, and you start adding more and more wind and solar to a single grid, that sees all the solar panels go off at the same time, all the wind turbines go off at the same time, it means that the amount of carbon you're avoiding by adding each next bit of wind or solar shrinks. That's why a lot of the people who want 100% wind and solar programs, they say, well, just be ready to build 4 times more than you think you need because we're just going to waste out a bunch of it. Or we're just going to throw out a bunch of the power. That's okay, it's so cheap to build wind and solar, it's fine. Well, yes, but if you do that, you start rapidly increasing the life cycle carbon numbers, whereas for nuclear, you can build enough nuclear plants to cover your near peak capacity, and then you just fill in the rest of the demand with consuming that nuclear power for petrochemicals industry or something like what I was talking about in the oil and gas slide.
Mark,
So, yeah.
Can I add a comment to that?
Yes, sure,
From the
Johnny.
microphone, just to complete what you were saying.
And I'm sorry, it is now 6:06 for anybody who needed to rush out with the hour, you can do so, but I'm happy to keep answering questions.
Just very quickly to your question, I think Mark explained it very clearly, but there is a report that is really easy to read and has great figures. It's made by the United Nations, UNESA. If you search for one of the articles that Sunniva and I have written in Aftenposten, you will find it. It says natur og kjernekraft som hånd I hanske. You'll find a link there. But what United Nations UNESA is the kind of economic organ for United Nations for Europe, and what they did was life cycle analysis, exactly what you were explaining. So it goes from mining the uranium all the way until you take the power station apart. It takes all the waste and deal with all of that. And what they found was that nuclear power has the lowest negative impact on resource use, which is use of minerals and metals. It has the lowest negative impact on ecosystems, which is climate. It has the lowest, as you pointed out, it has the lowest CO2 emissions. It has the lowest area need. It has the lowest material need. So that report is actually quite good. I think this is one of those great reports where you can see a comparison of all the low carbon energy sources. But it ends up.
But that report does not have, in my opinion, accurate figures for solar, because almost all the solar data used in the world for life cycle analysis assumes that the solar is made in Europe and stuff like that, which just it's not, and will probably never be ever again. So.
We have time for one more question, and I think Ambos was the one who had his hand up.
Although we. Okay.
Well, it's an important question because it's the one I get asked when I talk to politicians, which is about like the speed of deployment and development of nuclear in Norway. Like the answer that basically every politician gives you when they talk, well, nuclear is nice, but we don't have to care about it because it's after 2030, and we care about only before 2030. And then like IFA is saying it's after 2040, and like so how can we make it like faster, and like what's the realistic like with SMR and all this stuff, and like the policy changes that can speed up everything, and just to answer that basically.
Well, my first bit of advice is when somebody says something like that and pretends that 2030 is this magic time at which everything will be easy and just happen forever afterwards, you should go around and find a different way to talk about nuclear, and then they will correct themselves once they like nuclear. But if you're looking for what is the logical response that you can satisfy yourself with, you know about, or if you happen to find somebody so open-minded that they both think like that but actually do want to hear objections, here it is. If you take as long to build nuclear as the UAE did, and they took multiple years to get absolutely certain they had a very good start, like each stage of the program, they had rock solid before moving on to the next stage. They did a very staged, careful approach to build out their nuclear fleet. And they're gonna end up with all 4 of their reactors on, well, by the end of this year, so it's 2023. The idea of thinking about nuclear was sort of a 2005, 2006 idea. The proper moving forward with the industrial parts of their program were kind of 2010, 2011. Construction began 2012. And they're gonna have all 4 of their reactors on 11 years later. So you add that up, you get what, 15 years? That is like 2/3 of the lifetime of a bunch of your wind turbines. As in, they will all need to be like replaced or upgraded or updated after that, plus all the new wind turbines you need to do. So what I would explain is that you can use the very short, almost disposable lifetime of the wind and solar you're building as just like what your filler energy is to get the proper energy sources up and running. See what they think about that. My experience is that almost everybody thinks of wind as something you build and then it's just there, because 20 years is so long, it's like practically forever, right? It's not forever. People just have really bad total understandings of energy because they started with the ideology and then only backed into learning exactly what they needed to defend their ideological point. And I mean, this was an unusual presentation. I don't know if you've heard much about wind turbine insurance before today, but it is a really bad emerging issue. And one of the reasons that offshore wind projects are being canceled around the world is because the existing projects that had extremely low capital costs are not making money because they're wearing out faster than expected and they are producing less energy than expected for less value than expected. Anybody who says 2030 is the end of the energy story is not paying attention to these emerging trends in the energy source that they claim is going to do all the heavy lifting. So there you go. The answer is, by the time you get nuclear up to speed, enough capacity of the wind turbines that are there today will be gone that it will fit right in. And sorry, one in the back. Come on, one more.
All right, which one? Short answer, Mark.
Thank you. My name is Thomas Nordlander. I am the Vice President of IFE. You mentioned IFE before. I think it's a very nice talk you have, but I would like that we talk about nuclear in Norway. That's one discussion, but it doesn't help surviving the world if Norway sorts it out and get money from selling electricity. The main problem is really to remove coal from developing countries and replacing it with something. And sometimes when we talk down on solar or wind, it's maybe because they have talked down on nuclear, but it's actually a combination. The problem with solar and wind, they will not solve the problem, not a chance. When they have exploded the last couple of years, they have not reduced the use of coal, and coal is the bad part. And if you look at developing countries, very often the countries that have nuclear power plants, there's a correlation between them and countries that have high education, because it demands quite a lot. But to put up a coal power plant, it's cheap to get a coal. It is not that advanced. So maybe one of the big problems is actually looking at developing countries. How can we get them to get clean energy? And then if Norway succeed or get more money or not, it doesn't help us to have a lot of money if the rest of the world is burning, because it's the same world.
I hear you completely, and so one of the countries I'm most upset about and most pessimistic about is South Africa. South Africa is replacing coal power with societal collapse. That is what they're replacing coal power with. And I was in Glasgow for COP26, for the big climate conference, when there was this massive, joyous announcement between the head of state of South Africa and one of the top energy officials of Germany about this massive funding where Germany was going to help South Africa replace coal. One of the first things that happened, since this was late 2021 on the cusp of the Russian invasion, one of the first things that happens is that South Africa's coal plants keep collapsing to underinvestment and just very bad performance, but the extra coal goes to Germany to replace the hard coal that they expected to have bought from Russia. And Germany's argument was, well, we have to keep burning. We're so important to the economy of Europe. Wouldn't it be horrible if we didn't burn fossil fuels? And they're happy to burn the fossil fuels that they're telling very poor, even collapsing countries that they shouldn't have. That is just abhorrent. Well, there's some hope on this specific issue of coal to nuclear, not necessarily in the developing countries, but in general. I had that little image and quote from Bill Gates up there. Bill Gates' specific passion with his nuclear company is directly replacing it's not going to be a direct replacement of just the heat source part of the coal plant, but he's getting his first nuclear plants built to replace the lowest cost and most, what otherwise might have been the longest lasting American coal plants, the ones in the Powder River Basin coal area of Wyoming. And what goes really well with coal to nuclear? First of all, if you find somebody who claims they don't like the sound of a coal to nuclear transition, you've almost certainly outed them as an ideologue that should have nothing to do with energy policy. So that's very helpful as a filter. On the technical level, a coal power plant that's been operating, what does it have? Has a workforce that is reliable, shows up and does power generation. It has a community that is used to the real world trade-offs of doing heavy industry. You have power lines to a large capacity power plant. That is going to be the killer, that is the thing that perhaps more than almost anything else is going to end the wild energy dreams of Europe and the other countries, where it turns out that nobody actually wants to expand transmission, and the expanded transmission was not included in the energy cost of whether renewables were cheap or not. A rather big oversight, because they are absolutely required because the weather shifts around. Well, the coal plants already have the transmission, but that transmission is much less valuable to a wind farm or a solar farm, for God's sake, than it is to a nuclear facility. So the value capture is much higher for that particular bit of equipment. And then finally, any large thermal power plant, pretty much by definition, has access to some amount of cooling water. And that may be the bigger limiting factor for some of these nuclear projects, even more so than the transmission. But yeah, you still have that. Oh, and I'm sorry, I forgot. The rail lines that facilitate rapid, cheap moving of the construction materials that you do have to use for the nuclear plant. All of those things are going to lead rich country coal to nuclear transitions, and I'm very excited to see that develop in, say, the US and other places. It's a much trickier story for, say, India or China, which are world champions in building renewables while being world champions in building coal. I think the general principle I would say is this. If we needed a quick little slogan that's a way to think, especially for developing countries, we need to grow to clean energy, not shrink to green energy. The countries that are attempting to shrink down to the green energy, heck, the countries that are trying to grow green, I don't think that's going to work. I think they're just going to deflate by losing all their heavy industries and making their citizens use a lot less power. The shrink to green is not going to be a model that works for developing countries, because developing countries are already green because they're already extremely poor. They're already low carbon because they're very poor. So I don't think we're going to see like a green-led growth in those poor countries. Here's another thing. It has emerged just in the last couple of months in some peer-reviewed papers that almost all of the sort of global decarbonization studies that are based on wind and solar building up the economies of poor countries are based on a few things. One, typically extreme limits on how much energy that poor countries are ever supposed to get from their wind and solar. That helps juice the numbers. Here's another one. Using the cost of doing industrial business in a rich, developed country with a working rule of law, really clear property rights, really clear supply chains and ultra-high education levels, sophisticated finance sectors and consulting sectors. The cost of doing renewables in a rich country is not the same as the cost of doing renewables in a poor country. But if you use the rich country cost to assume that you magically develop and get rich country economics in the poor countries, you get really good-looking numbers. All of this, I think, is going to come to a great deal of grief, and the coal to nuclear in rich countries is going to provide a template for the poor countries that are building coal now. The developing countries that attempted to go to natural gas suffered extreme amounts of social and economic damage during this natural gas crisis in Europe, because countries richer than them just took the gas. That means to me that countries learned a very powerful lesson, and they're going to insist on coal, and they're going to work with whatever countries are willing to finance that coal, and they're going to make moral arguments at COP27, well, they already did, COP28, at these big climate conferences. They're going to make very clear and effective moral arguments that they deserve coal, and as fast as we can take the coal to nuclear transition lessons from the rich countries over to the poor countries that are insisting on coal now, the more of a chance that we'll have some kind of positive outcome in what I think is a darkening story for developing countries in the world.
All right, I think we need to end it there. Thank you, Mark.